supervisor was Greg Kotchuk, working with their external Jean-Sébastien Drouin. Here.
So we know low back pain is a serious issue. It's prevalent, disabling, and costly. However, what we don't know 85% of the time is the diagnosis of low back pain. Now, it has been postulated that because of their influence on spinal mechanics and their prevalence in the spine, that muscles are a likely source of back pain. Now, previous studies have looked at the relationship between low back pain and involuntary trunk muscle activation times. Now, when Kalawicki did this, he found that people with low back pain during certain perturbations had delayed muscle onset times. What he also found is that when he tested asymptomatic subjects who had delayed muscle onset, those people were predisposed to further low back injury. What he did to do this was he had a mechanism like this, and essentially the subjects were upright, being held back by a weight. Now, at a particular point, the weight was released, and he measured the response of the muscles here to get the subject upright. Now, the problem with this setup was that it was time consuming. Every time he released the weight, he had to redo it again. He had to set the whole thing up again. The acceleration that the subject had to fight against was essentially the force of gravity. It didn't change. Also, the velocity didn't change in relation to the acceleration. What he also had difficulty doing was testing in multiple directions because of the setup here. Now, there was a huge potential for discomfort. When he tested symptomatic subjects, imagine if you're sitting up here with low back pain, holding the weight back, and then all of a sudden it's released. There's a huge potential for discomfort. And again, one more thing that he couldn't find was the minimal acceleration or velocity needed to stimulate some of these muscles during these perturbations. So it would be nice if we could have something that would give us the ability to test in unlimited directions, unlimited accelerations and velocities, and hopefully find the minimum stimulus needed to activate these trunk muscles during these perturbations. So what we have at our disposal is this parallel robot technology that, when this platform moves, it can move in any direction, in any acceleration, and any velocity, allowing us hopefully to determine the minimal acceleration or velocity needed to stimulate some of these trunk muscles. So what we set out to do was kind of step back a little bit from what Kalawicki did and kind of refine it a little bit. So we wanted to see if there are any effects of this robot platform acceleration or velocity on trunk muscle onset times, and we wanted to find that minimal acceleration and velocity that could still stimulate the trunk muscle contraction. So we had 31 asymptomatic subjects who had no back pain for a period of 3 months. We recorded surface EMG on the thoracic and erector spinae, the internal, and external obliques, and the rectus abdominis muscles on both sides. Then these subjects were placed on the robot like so. When they were sitting up here, they had their eyes closed for that true involuntary response. Then we had 4 translations, 4 velocities, and 3 different accelerations, giving us a total of 48 possible combinations of perturbations. So graphically, what this looks like is we essentially held the velocity constant of the platform and changed the time it took the robot to get there. Or we held the acceleration constant and just changed the velocity of the robot platform. Now this is what this looks like visually. What we're looking at here is that first movement to the left. The robot comes back just to reset itself. For our EMG analysis, the raw EMG data was rectified and filtered, and then we analyzed the specific time trunk muscles activated through an automated process provided to us by Sotelo and colleagues. So for example, in this picture, here would be the time the muscle activated, and here would be where the robot started. So what we measured was the time it took for the muscles to activate when the robot started moving. We used a repeated measured ANOVA set at an alpha level of 0.05 for statistical analysis. Now, due to the physical limitations of the robot, with certain start-stop movements and certain subject masses, we were only successfully able to complete 31 out of the possible 48 movements. What we could analyze, however, was the full frontal plane of lateral flexion axis with holding velocity constant and changing acceleration, and holding acceleration constant and changing velocity. So what you see here are a lot of numbers. But I want you to pay attention to the fact that when holding velocity constant with changing accelerations, we see that only one muscle is significantly different in terms of muscle activation time. But when we look at that graphically, we see that there are no significant differences of this particular muscle in terms of acceleration changes. Again, when we look at holding acceleration constant with changing velocities, we see again, we have only one muscle that was significantly different in terms of muscle onset time. Graphically, here we have another example, no significant differences. So what does that mean? Coming back to our second objective, where we wanted to see if we could find that minimal acceleration or velocity to stimulate some of these muscles. Because here, at 0.25 Gs and at 150 millimeters per second, we still had muscle activation. We couldn't find that activation period because we did not test below those areas. Coming back to our first objective, we see that we have no significant differences in muscle response time between different magnitudes of acceleration and velocity. That means that the muscles that turned on here turned on at the exact same time as they did here. Again, for the velocity, the muscles here turned on at exactly the same time as they did here. So now, when we test subjects at this level here, we will still get the same response as we would here. So now there's a potential for testing symptomatic subjects, like Kulawicki did, at these low accelerations and velocities, with the potential for much less discomfort. So now, we have a tool to quickly and efficiently test the entire trunk muscle at low amplitudes of accelerations and velocities with the ability, with the potential for less discomfort with symptomatic subjects. And now if we go back to Kulawicki's work and what he found with asymptomatic subjects, if we look at that, and if we potentially find asymptomatic subjects that have delayed muscle onset times, which what Kulawicki said predisposes to further low back injury, we now have an assessment tool to identify that at-risk population and treat them effectively and preventatively. So for future studies, we could obviously test in that lower range of the spectrum that we did not test to see if they could find that activation period or that activation stimulus needed to still elicit the trunk muscle response. And now we can test symptomatic and asymptomatic subjects at a much less discomforting velocity and acceleration. So we'd just like to acknowledge the following people for their help in that work.